There is a prophecy that, in any straightforward historical sense, has never been fulfilled. Not once. Not in the 13th century, when it first began to circulate in the specific form that would make it politically useful. Not in the 14th, when the failure of its most celebrated instance, a hermit monk on a mountain in central Italy, was reinterpreted as persecution rather than falsification. Not in the 15th, when the Great Schism produced 3 simultaneous claimants to the papal throne and the prophecy was invoked by all 3 sides simultaneously, each convinced that the chaos of the present was the labor pain that preceded the birth of the figure the prophecy described. Not in the 16th, when the Reformation shattered the unity of Western Christianity and both Catholics and Protestants claimed the prophecy as their own Catholics, waiting for the Holy Pope who would restore the Church. Protestants arguing that the Holy Pope had already come, and his name was Martin Luther. Not in the 17th, when the prophecy had been formalized, institutionalized, and incorporated into the standard vocabulary of every significant papal conclave as a piece of political infrastructure so routine that no one thought to question whether it was working. And not in the 21st century, when Pope Francis was elected in 2013 and millions of people across every platform available for the distribution of hope identified him as the one, the reformer, the man from outside the system, the Jesuit from Buenos Aires who had taken the name of a saint who had crossed enemy lines at Damietta and sat down with the Sultan, the humble one, the one who rode public transport and paid his own hotel bills and refused the papal apartments and smiled at children and seemed, in the specific way that the prophecy had always described, to stand outside and above the corruptions that had made the institution he now led so desperately in need of exactly what he appeared to be. He was Pope for 12 years. He died in April 2025. The church he led was not transformed in the way the prophecy had described. But for many of those who had placed hope in Francis as a possible fulfillment of the template, disappointment did not kill the expectation. It shifted it forward. The next pope would be the one. The next pope. Always the next pope. This is what 700 years of the Angelic Pope prophecy looks like when you step back far enough to see the whole of it at once. Not a single prediction. Made once. Either confirmed or falsified by the events that followed. But a template, a recurring structure of expectation that attaches itself to each new moment of institutional crisis. Identifies a candidate. Watches the candidate fail to fulfill the expectation. And then detaches from the failed candidate and reattaches to the next one. Indefinitely. Without limit. Without the possibility of falsification. Because the template was never designed to be true. It was designed to be useful. And usefulness, unlike truth, does not expire. This is the episode that the previous 4 have been building toward. Not the story of Celestine V, though Celestine V is in this story. Not the story of Cardinal Pelagius and the Fifth Crusade, though the prophetic certainty that refused Jerusalem is in this story. Not the story of the Malachy forgery, though the most successful forgery in Vatican history is in this story. Not the story of Savonarola, though the man who burned Florence and was burned by Florence is in this story. This is the story of the template itself. The structure underneath all those stories. The mechanism that produced them all, and that is producing right now, in whatever moment you are watching this, the version of itself that belongs to the present. The Angelic Pope, the figure that every generation of Catholics in crisis has been waiting for. The Pope that never came, and never stopped being expected. Before there was a prophecy, there was a need. This is the order that matters. The histories of prophetic traditions tend to present the prophecy first to begin with the text. The document, the specific words attributed to a specific figure at a specific moment, and then to trace the influence of those words forward through time. This presentation is understandable. It follows the logic of the historical record. which preserves texts more reliably than it preserves needs, but it inverts the actual causal sequence. The text did not create the need created the text, and the need that created the Angelic Pope prophecy was not a medieval need, specific to the theological anxieties of the 13th century. It is a structural need, a need that emerges, with reliable consistency, from a particular kind of institutional situation. A situation in which an institution that claims divine authority has accumulated enough evidence of human failure that the gap between the claim and the evidence has become impossible to ignore. The Catholic Church, by the middle of the 13th century, had accumulated considerable evidence of human failure. Not because the 13th century was uniquely corrupt, corruption in the institutional church was not new, and later centuries would produce examples that made the 13th look relatively restrained. But because the 13th century was the century in which the gap between the church's claims and the church's reality had become, for the first time, genuinely visible to a large literate audience with the tools to articulate what they were seeing. The papacy of the 13th century was an institution of extraordinary power and extraordinary ambition. Innocent III, the Pope who called the Fourth Lateran Council, who organized the Fifth Crusade, who claimed authority over the temporal as well as the spiritual affairs of Christendom, had pushed the theory of papal authority to its furthest extent, asserting that the Pope was not merely the head of the Church but the vicar of Christ on earth, with authority that superseded the authority of every king and emperor. This was a very large claim. The institution making the claim was, simultaneously, deeply embedded in the political and financial structures of medieval Europe in ways that made the claim difficult to sustain with a straight face. Popes made war. Popes accumulated wealth. Popes appointed family members to ecclesiastical positions. Popes negotiated with secular rulers in the manner of secular rulers, using the spiritual weapons of excommunication and interdict as political tools in disputes that had nothing, obviously, to do with the salvation of souls. The gap between vicar of Christ and political operator was not invisible. It was the gap that Joachim of Fiore had organized his 3 ages around, the gap that the spiritual Franciscans had built their theology of the coming age of the Spirit on top of. A gap that Savonarola would stand in and shout across 500 years later, to congregations of 20,000 people who came to hear someone say out loud what they all already knew. The institution was not what it claimed to be. And into this gap, the gap between what the institution claimed and what it was, the Angelic Pope template inserted itself. The template has 4 elements. They are not always present in exactly the same form. They adapt to the specific crisis, the specific vocabulary, the specific institutional context in which the template is deployed. But they are always recognizable, once you know what you are looking for. The first element is the diagnosis. The institution is corrupt. Not merely imperfect, not merely the kind of institution that makes mistakes and falls short of its ideals in the ordinary way of human institutions. Fundamentally, systemically, characteristically corrupt. The corruption is not accidental. It is structural. It is the product of the institution's entanglement with the very forces wealth, power, political ambition that it is supposed to stand against. This diagnosis is not, in most of the historical instances we have examined, wrong. The institutional church of the 13th and 14th centuries was genuinely entangled with wealth and political power in ways that its own theological tradition condemned. The Borgia papacy of the 15th century was genuinely corrupt in ways that required no prophetic vision to perceive. The Renaissance church that Savonarola denounced was genuinely in need of reform in ways that the Council of Trent would eventually acknowledge. In many historical moments, the diagnosis began from a reality observers could plainly see. This is what gives the template its initial credibility. It begins from a true observation about the institution. The institution is not what it claims to be. The gap between the claim and the reality is real. The second element is the prognosis. Within the template, corruption is understood as something that cannot be adequately reformed from within. The institution is too deeply embedded in the structures that corrupt it. The people within the institution who might reform it are themselves shaped by the institution, compromised by it, dependent on it, unable to see clearly because they are inside the thing that needs to be seen clearly. Reform from within has been tried. It has failed, or it has been co-opted, or it has been suppressed. Therefore, reform must come from outside, not from the political processes that govern who becomes pope, not from the theological debates that happen within the existing structures, not from the cardinals who have spent their careers navigating the institutional hierarchy and are therefore, whatever their personal virtues, products of the system they are supposedly reforming from outside, from someone who is not part of the machinery, from someone who is in the specific vocabulary of the template, pure. The third element is the figure, the Angelic Pope. He is always described in terms of what he is not, rather than what he is. He is not wealthy. He is not political. He is not a product of the Roman Curia, or of the great families, or of the factional negotiations that govern every normal conclave. He is not ambitious. He is not calculating. He is not, and this is the crucial characteristic, the one that recurs across every version of the template across 7 centuries. He is not of the system. He is holy in the specific sense that holiness means. Within the template, he is untouched by the corruptions that have made the system corrupt. His purity is not merely personal. It is structural. He stands outside the institution, and his standing outside is the source of his ability to reform it. He is, within the template's imagination, almost angelic, a figure from a different moral order, temporarily inhabiting the institution in order to transform it. A figure from a different order of being, temporarily inhabiting the institutional role in order to transform it. The fourth element is the promise. When the Angelic Pope comes, everything changes. Not merely the specific corruptions of the specific moment, not merely the simony of this conclave, or the nepotism of this papal family, or the political manipulation of this specific institution. Everything. The age of the Spirit begins. The Church is renewed at its foundations. The long gap between the institution's claims and its reality is finally, definitively closed. The promise is total. It is also, necessarily and always, future. The Angelic Pope is coming. Not here yet, but coming. The signs are visible. The moment is approaching. The present crisis is the darkness before the dawn. This future orientation is the template's most important structural feature, because a promise that is always future is a promise that can never fail. The template, in the form that would become most influential, crystallized in the decades following Joachim of Fiore's death in 1202. Joachim himself, as we have established in previous episodes, was careful. He described the coming age of the Spirit in terms that were general enough to be plausible and specific enough to be compelling. He identified the direction of history without committing himself to the precise form that the transformation would take. The men who came after him were less careful. And the specific form that the template took in the hands of the spiritual Franciscans, the radical wing of the order that had been founded by Francis of Assisi himself, was the form that would be most politically influential for the next 4 centuries. The spiritual Franciscans had a specific institutional interest in the Angelic Pope prophecy. Their conflict with the mainstream Franciscan order, and through it, with the papacy, was a conflict about poverty. Specifically, about whether Christ and the apostles had owned property. The spiritual Franciscans argued that they had not, that Christ had been absolutely poor, and that the Franciscan order, in imitation of Christ, should also be absolutely poor. The mainstream order and the papacy argued that this position was heretical. This was not merely a theological dispute. It was a dispute about power. An institution that owns property has interests. It has things to protect. It has reasons to accommodate the political powers that can threaten those things, and reasons to avoid the kinds of confrontation that might lead to those threats being made. An institution that owns nothing has none of these constraints. It can say anything, do anything, go anywhere, challenge anyone because it has nothing to lose. The spiritual Franciscans wanted to be an institution that owned nothing. The papacy wanted them to own something. Into this conflict, the Angelic Pope template inserted itself with perfect precision. The Angelic Pope, in the spiritual Franciscan version of the template, was specifically a pope who would endorse the absolute poverty of Christ, who would resolve the theological dispute in favor of the spirituals, who would reform the church by returning it to the poverty that Christ had embodied, who would be himself poor, humble, outside the structures of wealth and power that had corrupted the institution. The template had acquired a specific political agenda. It was no longer merely a general expectation of institutional renewal. It was a weapon in the hands of people who needed the papacy to change in a specific direction, and who had found, in the language of prophetic expectation, a way to make that specific political demand appear to be a divine requirement. The anatomy of the template, the specific structure that made it so durable across so many different historical contexts, is worth examining in detail, because the detail is where the mechanism becomes visible. The template is, at its core, a solution to a specific problem. The problem is this: in an institution that claims divine authority, how do you argue for change? The difficulty is structural. If the institution is divinely authorized, if the Pope is the vicar of Christ, if the hierarchy is ordained by God, if the sacramental structure of the Church is the means through which God's grace is transmitted to humanity, then arguing for institutional change is arguing against God. The reformer who says this institution needs to change is implicitly saying that God's institution is wrong, which is either heresy or the beginning of schism. The template solves this problem elegantly. It does not argue that the institution is wrong. It argues that the institution has been temporarily corrupted by human agents who are themselves acting against God's intention for the institution. The corruption is not the institution. The corruption is what has happened to the institution. And the Angelic Pope, the figure who is coming, will not change the institution. He will restore it. He will return it to what God always intended it to be, before the corrupt agents hijacked it. This is the crucial rhetorical move: reform as restoration. The demand for change is framed as a demand for return, for the recovery of something that existed before the corruption. That is still the true form of the institution, that the current corruption is obscuring rather than constituting. The reformer is not a revolutionary. He is a restorer. This framing has several important effects. It makes the demand for change theologically safe. The reformer is not challenging divine authority, but invoking it against the corrupt agents who have distorted it. It makes the demand for change emotionally compelling. It appeals not to the desire for something new, but to the nostalgia for something lost. And it makes the demand for change institutionally flexible, because every faction, in every crisis, can define what the institution was originally supposed to be in whatever terms best serve their current interests. The spiritual Franciscans defined the original church as absolutely poor. The reformers of the Great Schism defined it as unified under a single legitimate pope. The pre-Reformation humanists defined it as learned, rational, and free from superstition. The Counter-Reformation Catholics defined it as doctrinally pure and hierarchically disciplined. The Piagnoni of Florence defined it as morally rigorous and politically engaged with the poor. Each of these definitions was from within the framework of the people who held it, the true original form of the institution. Each of them was from the perspective of the others, a projection of present interests onto a past that had never existed in quite that form. But all of them used the same template. All of them were waiting for the same Angelic Pope, described in different terms, to serve different purposes, running on the same mechanism. There is a text that illustrates the template's anatomy with particular clarity, a text that the Yale Beinecke Library holds in a beautifully illuminated 14th century copy, and that we have encountered briefly in previous episodes. The Vaditinia de Summis Pontificibus, the prophecies of the Supreme Pontiffs. It is not, as we have established, a genuine prophecy. It is a collection of illustrated papal images, each paired with a cryptic text, produced sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century and attributed, falsely, to Joachimo Fiore. Its images move through a sequence of papal figures, some corrupt, some reforming toward a culminating figure of conspicuous holiness. The culminating figure is the Angelic Pope, the one the whole sequence has been building toward. The text is not specific about when the Angelic Pope will arrive. It is not specific about what his name will be. It is not specific about the precise form his transformation of the Church will take. It is specific only about what he will be, outside the system. Hoi, for, coming. These four characteristics are the core of the template. They are the characteristics that were identified with Celestine V in 1294 outside the system. Hoi, pour, seemingly coming. They are the characteristics that were identified with various candidates in the conclaves of the 14th and 15th centuries. They are the characteristics that Savonarola claimed for himself in the 1490s. They are the characteristics that the Malachy forgery was designed to confirm in specific candidates in the 1590 conclave. And they are the characteristics that people identified in Francis in 2013, outside the system. The first Jesuit pope, the first pope from the Americas, the man who paid his own hotel bill. Holy, the simplicity, the directness, the refusal of the papal apartments. Poor, the emphasis on the poor, the critique of the Church's wealth, the Franciscan name, coming, elected, at the moment when the papacy seemed most in need of exactly what he appeared to offer. The template was 700 years old when it was applied to Francis. It fit him as well as it had fit Celestine V, and it produced, in the people who applied it, the same quality of expectation. The expectation that this time finally, at last, after all the centuries of waiting and all the failed instances, this time was the time. It was not. The template reset and began again. The first time the Angelic Pope template was deployed in a specific institutional context, not as a general theological expectation but as a political tool aimed at a specific outcome in a specific conclave, was not 1294. It was earlier, considerably earlier. The deployment at Celestine V's election, which we examined in the first episode of this season, was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment at which the story became most visible, the moment at which the template produced its most celebrated instance, the one that Dante wrote about, the one that historians have argued over for 7 centuries. But by 1294, the template had already been in active political use for 50 years. Understanding the earlier uses is understanding how the template developed, how it moved from a general theological expectation about the future of the Church into a specific, repeatable, institutional mechanism that could be applied to any conclave and any crisis with the reliability of a well-maintained tool. The template did not appear fully formed. It was built, incrementally, across decades, by people with specific institutional interests, who found in the language of prophetic expectation a way to advance those interests that was more powerful than any argument they could have made in the normal vocabulary of ecclesiastical politics. The death of Gregory IX in August 1241 produced a conclave that lasted for over a year and a half. Gregory had been pope since 1227, a long, contentious pontificate defined primarily by his conflict with Frederick II. The Holy Roman Emperor, whose complicated relationship with the papacy was one of the central political dramas of the 13th century. Frederick had been excommunicated by Gregory. Gregory had died before the conflict was resolved, and the College of Cardinals, attempting to elect his successor in the specific political environment that Frederick's power had created, found themselves unable to agree. The conclave of 1241 was conducted under conditions that contemporary accounts describe as approaching medieval torture. Cardinal Senator Matteo Rosso Orsini, not a pope, but the political authority in Rome, locked the cardinals in a building without adequate food, water, or sanitation, apparently believing that physical discomfort would accelerate the process of reaching agreement. One cardinal died during the proceedings. Others became seriously ill. The conclave lasted from August 1241 to October 1243. 2 popes were elected and died in quick succession. The third conclave, in 1243, finally produced a candidate who survived long enough to govern, Sinibaldo Fieschi, who took the name Innocent IV. In the margins of this prolonged institutional crisis in the letters, the theological texts, the pastoral writings that circulated among the Franciscan and Dominican communities of Italy during the vacancy, the language of the Angelic Pope began to appear with increasing frequency, not yet as a specific prediction about a specific candidate, as an expression of need. The Church needed a leader who was not entangled in the conflict between Frederick and the papacy, who stood above the factional politics that had made the conclave impossible, who was holy in the specific sense of being outside the corruptions that had produced the crisis. The template was not yet a weapon. It was a prayer. But prayers, in the institutional church of the 13th century, had a way of becoming weapons. The vacancy that followed the death of Clement IV in November 1268 was the longest in the history of the Church before or since. 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. 1006 days during which the throne of St. Peter was empty, during which the institutional machinery of the papacy deteriorated without leadership, during which the enemies of the Church watched the empty throne with the interested attention of people who have discovered that their opponent has left himself undefended. The conclave that was supposed to fill the vacancy met in Viterbo, north of Rome, where the College of Cardinals had gathered to elect Clement IV's successor. The cardinals were divided along factional lines that made agreement impossible, not the Colonna-Orsini divide that would produce the deadlock of 1292, but an earlier version of the same structural problem, in which the political interests of the Italian cardinals, the French cardinals, and the various secular powers who had relationships with individual electors made any majority impossible to construct. They argued. They voted. They failed. They argued again. The population of Viterbo, observing the spectacle of the most powerful institution in the Western world unable to perform its most basic function, eventually took matters into their own hands. The city authorities locked the cardinals in the building where they were meeting and began to reduce their food supply. When this produced insufficient urgency, the roof of the building was removed, leaving the cardinals exposed to the elements. The cardinals elected Tedaldo Visconti as Pope Gregory IX. He was not a cardinal. He was not even a priest. He was in the Holy Land when the news of his election reached him. and the manner of his election, the vacancy, the deadlock, the intervention of secular authority, the eventual choice of a man who was outside the institutional hierarchy produced, in the theological and political literature of the period, the most systematic development of the Angelic Pope template that had yet appeared, because Gregory X, viewed through the lens of the template, looked like exactly what the template described. He was outside the system, not a cardinal, not a product of the factional politics that had produced the deadlock. He was in the Holy Land, engaged in the actual work of Christian witness, in the most sacred geography of the faith, rather than in the administrative and political machinery of the Roman Curia. He was, in the specific vocabulary of the template, pure. Whether he actually was is a separate question. What matters, for the history of the template, is that he appeared to be an appearance within the prophetic framework. His evidence, Gregory X turned out to be a capable, reforming pope who convened the Second Council of Lyon and attempted, with partial success, to address some of the institutional problems that the vacancy had revealed. He also established the formal conclave system, the locked room, the reduced food supply, the procedures designed to make the election of a pope uncomfortable enough that cardinals would stop prolonging it, specifically because his own election had demonstrated how badly the existing system could fail. He proved to be a capable reforming pope, but he did not become the transformative figure the template had projected onto him. He did not transform the church. He did not inaugurate the age of the Spirit. He did not close the gap between the institution's claims and its reality in any permanent way. He governed. He reformed where he could. He died in January 1276, less than 4 years after his election, and the template, which had attached itself to his election with such enthusiasm, detached itself from his governance and waited for the next vacancy, which, given the mortality of popes, was not long in coming. The 3 popes who followed Gregory X all died within a year of their election. 3 popes, 3 deaths, 3 new conclaves, each one producing another vacancy that the template could attach to another moment of institutional crisis in which the language of prophetic expectation was available to people who needed it. By the time the papacy stabilized again in the late 1270s, the Angelic Pope template had been deployed, in various forms, in half a dozen conclaves. Each deployment had produced the same sequence: expectation, election, disappointment, reinterpretation, renewed expectation. The template was not being killed by its failures. It was being refined by them. Each failure taught the people who used the template something about how to use it more effectively next time. The expectation needed to be attached to candidates who were more plausibly outside the system. The description of the Angelic Pope needed to be sufficiently vague that the failure of any specific candidate to fulfill it could be attributed to external obstruction rather than inherent inadequacy. The promise needed to be located far enough in the future that immediate disappointment could be absorbed without destroying the framework. The template was learning. Not in the literal sense, it was not a conscious agent capable of learning, but in the evolutionary sense. The versions of the template that were more precisely calibrated to produce durable expectations survived and were repeated. The versions that were too specific, too tied to particular candidates, too vulnerable to immediate falsification died with their failures. What survived was the template in its most resilient form, vague enough to accommodate any candidate, flexible enough to absorb any failure, compelling enough to generate renewed expectation after every disappointment. This was the template that attached itself to Pietro di Morone in 1294. This was the template that produced Celestine V. The failure of Celestine V, the resignation, the imprisonment, the death in Fumone was the most spectacular failure the template had yet produced. It was also In the long history of the Angelic Pope prophecy, the most instructive, because the response to Celestine's failure established, definitively, the mechanism by which the template absorbed its failures without being destroyed by them. The mechanism was reinterpretation. Not the reinterpretation of the specific prediction, not the acknowledgement that the prediction had been wrong, accompanied by a revision of the template's core claims, but the reinterpretation of the failure itself, the transformation of the failure from evidence against the template into evidence for it. Celestine V had been the Angelic Pope. He had failed. Therefore, the forces of corruption were so powerful that they could destroy even the Angelic Pope. Therefore, the corruption was worse than previously understood. Therefore, the need for the Angelic Pope was more urgent than ever. Therefore, he was still coming, the real one, the one who could not be destroyed by Boniface VIII or by any other representative of the corrupt system, the one whose holiness was sufficient not merely to be elected but to actually govern, to actually transform the institution rather than being swallowed by it. The failure had become a proof. This is the mechanism that makes the template unkillable. It does not merely survive its failures. It feeds on them. Each failure deepens the diagnosis. The corruption is worse than we thought. Each failure intensifies the expectation the true Angelic Pope must be more holy, more outside the system, more completely pure than the one who failed. Each failure narrows the description of what the Angelic Pope will look like, not this, not someone who can be manipulated, not someone who can be imprisoned, someone stronger, someone more pure, someone more completely outside the system. The template becomes more demanding with each failure, and more demanding templates produce more intense expectations. And more intense expectations produce more profound disappointments. And more profound disappointments feed back into the template as evidence of the corruption's power. The cycle is self-sustaining. It has been running since 1294. It has not stopped. The spiritual Franciscans who survived Celestine V's failure, the men who had proclaimed his election as the dawn of the age of the Spirit and watched the dawn extinguish itself in the December air of Naples, did not simply move on. They did something more consequential. They wrote. The literature that the spiritual Franciscans produced in the decades following Celestine V's resignation and death is one of the most extraordinary bodies of prophetic writing in the history of the medieval church. It is extraordinary not because it is accurate, it is almost entirely inaccurate, in the sense that its specific predictions did not come true, but because it demonstrates, with remarkable clarity and consistency, how a prophetic tradition processes failure and emerges from the processing more elaborate, more systematic, and more politically useful than it was before. The key figure in this literature is Angelo Clarino, a spiritual Franciscan leader who lived through the entire arc of the late 13th and early 14th century, who had known Celestine V personally, who had been among the spirituals who had proclaimed his election, and who survived long enough to watch the template attach itself to new candidates and fail again with them. Clarino's response to the failure of Celestine V was not to abandon the framework. It was to elaborate it, to produce, in his History of the Seven Tribulations, a sweeping account of the Franciscan Order's history as a sequence of divine tests, a narrative that incorporated every failure as evidence of the template's essential truth. The tribulations were the proof. The corruption that had destroyed Celestine V was evidence of how powerful the enemy was. The enemy's power was evidence of how necessary the Angelic Pope's coming was. The Angelic Pope's failure to come yet was evidence of how much more the faithful needed to suffer before they were worthy of him. The suffering was evidence of the template's truth. The template was evidence of the suffering's meaning. The loop was closed, and inside the closed loop, the expectation burned more intensely than it had before Celestine V's failure, because now it had been tested, and the testing had not destroyed it, which meant within the framework that it was true. By the early 14th century, the Angelic Pope template had produced a substantial body of literature, a set of institutional practices within the spiritual Franciscan movement, and a vocabulary of expectation that had spread well beyond the Franciscans into the broader culture of Italian religious life. It had also produced its first major political confrontation with the papacy. John XXIII, who reigned from 1316 to 1334, was one of the most administratively capable and theologically aggressive popes of the medieval period. He was also, from the perspective of the spiritual Franciscans, the precise embodiment of everything the Angelic Pope was supposed to correct: a lawyer pope, a bureaucrat pope, a pope who solved theological problems with legal instruments and institutional power rather than with the spiritual authority that the template described. He condemned the spiritual Franciscan doctrine of absolute poverty as heretical. He prosecuted the spiritual Franciscans with the full apparatus of the Inquisition. He drove them underground, into exile, into the arms of Frederick of Sicily and Louis of Bavaria, the secular rulers who had their own reasons to support a Franciscan movement that was attacking the political authority of the papacy. And the spiritual Franciscans, prosecuted and exiled and deprived of institutional standing, responded by intensifying the template. The Angelic Pope they were waiting for was no longer merely a reforming pope. He was a pope who would undo what John XX had done, who would restore the doctrine of absolute poverty, who would vindicate the martyrs of the spiritual Franciscan movement, the men who had been burned for heresy for holding positions that the Angelic Pope would declare orthodox. The template had become specific enough to constitute a political program, and specific enough to constitute a direct challenge to the sitting papacy. John XXII's response was to condemn the Angelic Pope literature as heretical, not the general expectation of a reforming pope that was too widespread to condemn without appearing to oppose the reform that the Church's own tradition required, but the specific political deployments of the template, the specific claims that the current papacy was so corrupt that only a divinely appointed outsider could reform it, the specific predictions that named candidates and specified outcomes. These were condemned. The condemnations did not stop the template from running. They added to the literature. The condemnation of the Angelic Pope prophecy became, within the framework, evidence that the corrupt papacy was trying to suppress the prophecy of its own replacement, which was, of course, exactly what you would expect a corrupt papacy to do. The template absorbed the condemnation and continued. In 1378, the papacy produced something that even the most pessimistic observer of institutional dysfunction would have found difficult to anticipate. It produced two popes, simultaneously, both claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter, both issuing bulls and excommunications and appointments, both maintaining courts, both claiming the obedience of the faithful, both denouncing the other as an anti-pope and a schismatic and a fraud. The Great Schism, the division of the Western Church between the Roman line and the Avignon line that began in 1378 and lasted until 1417, was not merely an administrative crisis. It was a theological catastrophe. The papacy's claim to authority rested on its claim to be the unbroken succession of St. Peter, the single legitimate holder of the keys that Christ had given to Peter at Caesarea Philippi. An institution that simultaneously produced two men who both claimed to hold those keys was an institution whose foundational claim had been visibly falsified. The faithful were not merely confused about who was pope. They were confronted with evidence that the mechanism by which popes were produced was capable of producing contradictory results. And a mechanism that produces contradictory results is a mechanism that does not work. Into this catastrophe, the largest institutional crisis the Church had experienced since the Great Schism of 1054, the Angelic Pope template inserted itself with the energy of an idea whose moment had finally arrived. Because if there had ever been a moment that appeared to demand the Angelic Pope, the figure from outside the system, the Holy One untouched by the corruptions of institutional politics, the one who could restore what the institution had failed to maintain, it was this moment. The system had produced two popes. Therefore, the system needed to be transcended. Therefore, the Angelic Pope was more necessary than ever. Therefore, he was coming. The Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418 and eventually resolved the Great Schism by deposing two of the competing claimants and securing the resignation of the third, is remembered primarily as an institutional achievement, the moment when the broader Church asserted its authority over the papacy and resolved, through conciliar procedure, a crisis that the papacy itself had been unable to resolve. It is less often remembered as a moment of intense prophetic expectation, but it was both. The men who assembled at Constance, theologians, bishops, cardinals, representatives of secular rulers. The full spectrum of late medieval Christian intellectual and political life brought with them not merely the institutional agenda of ending the schism, but the accumulated weight of a century and a half of Angelic Pope expectation. The schism was, within the prophetic framework, the most compelling evidence yet produced of the template's diagnosis. The institution was corrupt to its foundations. The corruption was so total that it had produced three simultaneous claimants to the throne of St. Peter. The reform that was needed was not incremental. It was total. The Angelic Pope was coming. He would come out of Constance. He would be the Pope who emerged from the conclave that the Council would eventually authorize, the Pope who would govern a reunified Church, who would implement the reforms that the Council was debating, who would be, at last, the figure that 7 generations of expectation had been building toward. The Council authorized a conclave. The conclave elected Odone Colonna. He took the name Martin V. He was a Colonna, the family that had been at the center of Roman factional politics for generations. The family that had been the Orsini's great rivals in the conclaves of the 13th century. The family from whose factional maneuvering the institution had been trying to free itself for decades. A Colonna, the Angelic Pope expectation, which had been building through the Council of Constance toward what seemed like its inevitable fulfillment, encountered a Colonna. The template reset, and the people who had been waiting for the Angelic Pope to emerge from Constance began. With the specific resilience that the template had developed over a century and a half of practice, to explain why Martin V was not the one and why the next Pope, or the one after, or the one after that, would be the 15th century is, from the perspective of the Angelic Pope template, the century in which the template achieved something that it had not previously managed. It became respectable. Not in the sense that it was endorsed by the institutional Church. The popes of the 15th century were no more enthusiastic about the Angelic Pope prophecy than their predecessors had been. And for the same reasons. A prophecy that described the current pope as a corrupt placeholder waiting to be replaced by a divinely appointed outsider was not a prophecy that any sitting pope was inclined to encourage, but in the sense that it was taken seriously, discussed, debated, cited, applied by people whose intellectual credentials were beyond serious challenge, by humanist scholars, by theologians who had been trained in the new philological methods that the Renaissance had developed for the analysis of ancient texts, by men who were, by any measure of their contemporaries, among the most sophisticated thinkers in Europe. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest humanist scholar of the early 16th century, the man who produced the first critical edition of the Greek New Testament, whose praise of folly was the most devastating satirical critique of institutional corruption that the period produced, did not simply repeat apocalyptic prophecy, but he expressed forms of reformist hope that later readers could place alongside the Angelic Pope template. The template had become part of the standard vocabulary of reform-minded Catholic intellectuals. He did not cite it as a prophecy in the technical sense, as a supernatural prediction of future events that was guaranteed to come true. He cited it as a description of what the Church needed, as a way of articulating the gap between the institution's claims and its reality, and of expressing the hope that the gap might someday be closed by the right person in the right moment. The template, in Erasmus's usage, had been partially secularized. It had moved from the domain of supernatural prediction to the domain of political hope. This is a significant transition. When a prophetic template is understood as supernatural prediction, it is evaluated by the criteria of prediction. Was the prediction accurate? Did the events confirm or falsify the claim? The template is, by these criteria, vulnerable because predictions can be tested, and the Angelic Pope prophecy had been tested repeatedly, and had failed. When a prophetic template is understood as political hope, it is evaluated by different criteria. Is the hope reasonable? Is the need it expresses genuine? Is the description of what would be needed to address that need accurate? By these criteria, the template is considerably more defensible because the need it expressed was genuine, and the description of what addressing that need would require was not unreasonable. The Church was corrupt. This was observable. A reforming pope who was genuinely outside the machinery of corruption would be more likely to reform it effectively than one who was embedded in it. This was plausible. The hope that such a pope might someday appear was not irrational. By reframing the template as political hope rather than supernatural prediction, the humanists of the 15th century made it intellectually respectable in a way that it had not previously been. And intellectually respectable ideas spread further and last longer than ideas that are dismissed as superstition. The template was not merely surviving, it was upgrading. The figure who embodies most completely the transition of the Angelic Pope template from prophetic prediction to political program, and who connects the medieval tradition of the template to the modern world in the most direct possible way, is not a pope. He is a friar. He is, as we established in the previous episode, Girolamo Savonarola. But Savonarola's relationship to the Angelic Pope template is more complex than the previous episode had space to fully explore. Savonarola did not claim to be the Angelic Pope. He claimed to be the prophet of the Angelic Pope. This distinction is important. The Angelic Pope, in Savonarola's version of the template, was not Savonarola himself. He was the figure who would emerge from the reform that Savonarola was preparing Florence, and through Florence, Italy, and through Italy, the Church to receive. Savonarola was the voice crying in the wilderness. The Angelic Pope was the one who would follow. His positioning was, from the perspective of the template's political deployment, considerably more sophisticated than the straightforward identification of a specific candidate as the Angelic Pope. It had several advantages. It allowed Savonarola to appropriate the authority of the prophetic tradition without making a specific claim that could be immediately falsified. He was not predicting that Florence would produce the Angelic Pope. He was predicting that Florence's reform would prepare the way for whatever form God chose to send the Angelic Pope in. It allowed the template to survive Savonarola's own fall. When Savonarola was burned in 1498, the Angelic Pope prophecy did not fall with him because Savonarola had never claimed to be the Angelic Pope. It was the precursor. The precursor had been martyred. The martyrdom was evidence of the corruption's power. The corruption's power was evidence of the Angelic Pope's necessity. Template continued. It always continued. And it continued, after Savonarola, in a form that was more politically sophisticated, more institutionally embedded, and more resistant to falsification than it had been before, because Savonarola's career had taught the people who used the template something important. The prophet of the Angelic Pope is more durable than the Angelic Pope himself, because the prophet can be right even when the Angelic Pope fails to arrive. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, was the Catholic Church's formal response to the Protestant Reformation, the most sustained and comprehensive attempt at institutional self-reform that the Church had mounted since the Council of Constance a century earlier. It was also, though this tends to be under-emphasized in the standard histories of the period, a moment of intense Angelic Pope expectation. The cardinals and bishops and theologians who assembled at Trent were men who had grown up in the tradition of Erasmian humanism, who had read Savonarola's writings, who were aware of the prophetic literature that had been circulating since the 13th century, and who understood with the specific clarity of people who have watched their institution be split in half by a German monk nailing theses to a door that the diagnosis the Angelic Pope template had been offering for 250 years was not wrong. The Church needed radical reform. The corruption was real. The gap between the institution's claims and its reality was as wide as it had ever been. What they disagreed about was the form the reform should take, and the Angelic Pope template was deployed. In the debate surrounding the Council of Trent, by every faction in support of every position, the reformers used it to argue that the council needed to be more radical, that the superficial reforms being proposed were insufficient, that what was needed was the total transformation the template had always described, that the council should produce not a revised institutional church but the Angelic Pope's church. The conservatives used it to argue that the council's reforms were themselves the fulfillment of the prophecy, that the institutional renewal being accomplished through the conciliar process was the transformation the template had promised, that the Angelic Pope had arrived in the form of a reformed council rather than a single individual. The radicals used it to argue that no council could produce what only a divinely appointed individual could provide, that the template was not being fulfilled by Trent and would not be until the actual Angelic Pope arrived. 3 factions, 3 deployments of the same template, 3 mutually contradictory conclusions, all running on the same mechanism. The Reformation produced, for the Angelic Pope template, the most significant structural change since the spiritual Franciscans had developed it in the early 14th century. It split the template. Before the Reformation, the Angelic Pope was always a Catholic figure, a reform of the Catholic papacy, a restoration of what the Catholic Church was supposed to be. The template operated within a world in which the institutional church was, whatever its failures, the only church. The Angelic Pope was the figure who would reform that church, not replace it. After the Reformation, the template was available to 2 different institutional frameworks. For Catholics, the Angelic Pope was the Pope who would restore the unity that the Reformation had shattered, who would be holy enough to draw the Protestants back, pure enough to close the gap between the institution's claims and its reality that the Reformation had exploited, powerful enough in his spiritual authority to make the political and theological arguments for reunion unnecessary. For Protestants, the Angelic Pope had already come. He had come in the form of Luther, or Calvin, or Zwingli, or whichever reformer the specific Protestant tradition identified as the instrument of God's renewal of the Church. This is the most remarkable transformation in the template's long history. The same template, the same 4 elements, the same structure of diagnosis, prognosis, figure, and promise was now being used simultaneously by people who were at war with each other to support positions that were directly contradictory. Catholics, the Angelic Pope will restore the Church. Protestants, the Angelic Pope has restored the Church, both using the same language, both drawing on the same tradition, both organized around the same fundamental claim that the institutional corruption was real, that the reform was necessary. that the figure who had accomplished the reform was outside the existing system. The only disagreement was about tense, and about which institutional framework the figure stood outside of. This is the template's ultimate demonstration of its flexibility. It can be used by any reform movement, in any institutional context, to argue for any position, as long as the position involves the claim that the current institution is corrupt and that the right person, coming from outside it, can fix everything. That is a very large space of possible deployments, large enough to accommodate the entire history of Western Christianity since the 13th century, and then some. Martin Luther read Savonarola's prison meditations in the early years of the Reformation. He published them twice. He called Savonarola a holy man. He said, "Christ has canonized him." What Luther found in Savonarola's writings was not merely a precursor, a man who had anticipated the Reformation's critique of institutional corruption and been destroyed by the institution he critiqued. He found, in Savonarola's prison meditations, a theology of grace and repentance that resonated with the theology he was developing, a theology that located salvation in the direct relationship between the individual and God, rather than in the mediating apparatus of the institutional church. This was not the Savonarola of the bonfire of the vanities. It was not the Savonarola of the moral enforcement regime or the theocratic governance of Florence. It was the Savonarola who had been stripped of everything of authority, of followers, of the prophetic identity that had organized his entire adult life, and who had, in the prison cell, returned to the simple practice of scriptural meditation. That Savonarola Luther found useful. But Luther's engagement with Savonarola illustrates something important about how the Angelic Pope template was being processed by the Reformation generation. Luther was not waiting for an Angelic Pope. He had concluded from the evidence of Savonarola's fate, from the evidence of every reforming figure the template had produced before Savonarola, from the evidence of the Reformation's own early history, that the Angelic Pope was not coming from within the institutional church. Luther increasingly treated papal reform from within as inadequate to the scale of the problem he thought he was confronting. That the template was right about the diagnosis, the corruption was real and structural and not correctable from within, but wrong about the prognosis. The reform would not come from a holy pope. It would come from outside the papacy entirely. It would come from Wittenberg, from a monk who had been nailing theses. Luther was not claiming to be the Angelic Pope. He was claiming something more radical, that the papacy itself was not the institution through which God was working, and that the Angelic Pope prophecy, the entire tradition of expecting reform to come from a holy pope, was a misdirection, a way of keeping reformers invested in the institutional church, waiting for a pope who would never come, rather than building the alternative. This is the Reformation's contribution to the history of the template, not the deployment of it in support of a specific candidate. The argument that the template itself was the problem, that the eternal return of Angelic Pope expectation was a mechanism for keeping people inside a corrupt institution by promising them, perpetually, that the institution was about to reform itself. The promise that never arrived, the Pope that never came. Luther's solution was to stop waiting. Not everyone agreed. The Catholics who remained in the institutional church continued to wait. They are still waiting. In 1545, the first session of the Council of Trent opened in the small northern Italian city that gave the council its name. The men who assembled there, theologians, bishops, cardinals, papal legates, were men who understood, with the specific clarity of people who have watched their institution lose half its membership in a generation, that the moment was serious. The Reformation had not been a theological dispute that could be resolved by a sharper argument or a more authoritative condemnation. It had been a structural rupture, a demonstration that the gap between the institution's claims and its reality was wide enough to drive a German monk and his followers through it and out the other side into a new institutional framework entirely. The Council of Trent was the Catholic Church's attempt to close that gap. Not entirely. Not in the radical, total, Angelic Pope level way that the template had always described, but substantially. Enough to stop the hemorrhage. Enough to give the people who remained in the institutional church reasons to stay that were more compelling than the reasons they had been given before. The council met intermittently for 18 years. It reformed the training of priests. It clarified the church's doctrinal positions on the questions that the Reformation had raised. It addressed, with varying degrees of effectiveness, some of the more egregious institutional corruptions, the simony, the absenteeism, the sale of indulgences that had provided Luther with his most effective rhetorical ammunition. It did not produce the Angelic Pope. It produced something that was, in certain respects, more significant. A reformed institution that no longer needed the Angelic Pope in quite the same way, or so it appeared. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church's sustained response to the Protestant challenge, of which the Council of Trent was the theological center, changed the Angelic Pope template in ways that would not become fully visible until the template's next major deployment. The most important change was institutional capture. Before the Counter-Reformation, the Angelic Pope template was primarily an outsider's tool. It was used by people who were on the margins of the institutional church, radical Franciscans, apocalyptic preachers, reform-minded humanists to argue that the institution needed to change in ways that the institution was resisting. The template was, in its structural logic, adversarial to the institutional church. It said, the institution is corrupt. The institution cannot reform itself. The reform must come from outside. After the Counter-Reformation, the template was incorporated into the institutional church's own vocabulary. Not officially. Not in the form of a doctrinal endorsement of Angelic Pope prophecy, but in the sense that the language of the template, the expectation of a holy, reforming, spiritually pure Pope who would lead the church in a moment of crisis, became part of how the institutional church described its own aspirations for its leaders. After Trent, many papal elections unfolded in an atmosphere shaped, at least indirectly, by the aspiration for a holy, reforming Pope. The cardinals in the Sistine Chapel were not merely making political calculations about factional advantage. They were also operating within an institutional culture in which the ideal of the spiritually serious, reforming pontiff had become newly powerful. The template had been domesticated, from a weapon pointed at the institution from outside. It had become a frame through which the institution understood its own best self, and this domestication had a specific consequence. It made the template more durable, because an outsider's weapon can be suppressed, condemned, prosecuted, driven underground. But an institution's aspiration for its own best self cannot be suppressed without the institution appearing to abandon its own values. You cannot tell the College of Cardinals that they should stop hoping for a holy pope without appearing to endorse unholy ones. The template was now inside the walls, and inside the walls, it was much harder to kill. The specific mechanism by which the Counter-Reformation captured the Angelic Pope template can be traced through the careers of the popes who reigned in the decades immediately following the Council of Trent. The first of these was Pius V, who reigned from 1566 to 1572. Pius V, by the standards of the papal office in the 16th century, an extraordinary figure. He was a Dominican friar, a man of genuine personal austerity, who maintained the monastic discipline of his order even in the papal apartments of the Vatican. He walked barefoot in the corridors. He fasted. He prayed. He was, in the specific vocabulary of the template, outside the system of luxury and political calculation that had characterized so many of his predecessors. He was also, simultaneously, the driving force behind the Battle of Lepanto, the naval engagement in which a combined Catholic fleet defeated the Ottoman fleet in 1571, and the Pope who excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I of England and attempted, through the bull Regnans and Excelsis, to depose her. He was holy. He was also deeply enmeshed in the political conflicts of his time. But the holiness was real enough, visible enough, consistent enough, sufficiently grounded in a lifetime of genuine monastic practice that the people who applied the Angelic Pope template to his pontificate could do so with some plausibility. Pius V did not transform the Church in the way the template described, but he was, in the opinion of people who cared about such things, a genuinely holy pope. And that appearance, the appearance of a pope who was not merely an administrator but a saint, was itself a demonstration that the template's aspiration was not entirely unrealizable. That holiness and the papal office could coexist. That the gap between the institution's claims and its reality could be narrowed, even if not closed. He was canonized in 1712. He was later canonized, and his canonization gave later readers of the template a powerful example of papal holiness, made official. The template noted the fact, and used it. The conclave of 1590, the conclave that produced the Malachi forgery, that we examined in detail in episode 3, is the moment at which the Counter-Reformation's capture of the Angelic Pope template became fully visible. Because the Malachi forgery was not merely a political tool designed to advance a specific candidate. It was, simultaneously, a deployment of the Angelic Pope template in its most Counter-Reformation form, the form in which the template was no longer an outsider's critique of the institution, but an insider's aspiration, institutionalized into a list. The Malachi prophecy described every future pope. It described each one with the compressed, symbolic language of the prophetic tradition, and it described the sequence as moving, over time, toward a conclusion, toward the final pope, the one whose reign would precede the Last Judgment. This was the Angelic Pope template mapped onto the entire future of the papacy. Not a single figure arriving to transform the institution. A sequence, a process, a movement through history toward a culmination. The Counter-Reformation papacy was not merely the corrupt institution that needed to be transcended. It was a stage in the divine sequence, one more step on the road toward the ultimate fulfillment that the template had always promised. The template had been incorporated into the institution's own eschatology, and in being incorporated, it had been transformed from a challenge to the institution into a validation of it. The institution was moving toward its own fulfillment. The corruption was a stage, not a destination. The Angelic Pope was still coming, but now he was coming through the institution, not outside it. Now the institution itself was the vehicle. This is the domestication completed. There is a figure who represents, more completely than any other, the full Counter-Reformation form of the Angelic Pope template. He is not a pope. He's a theologian, a mystic, and one of the most influential figures in the history of the Jesuit order, the order that would, 450 years after his death, produce the first Jesuit pope in history. His name is Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine was born in 1542, the year before the Council of Trent opened its first session, and died in 1621. He spent his career as the most systematic and sophisticated defender of Catholic doctrine against the Protestant challenge, producing in his controversies a theological work so comprehensive and so carefully argued that Protestant theologians across Europe spent decades trying to answer it. Bellarmine is a useful figure for thinking about the Counter-Reformation reception of the Angelic Pope tradition. He represents a type that matters here, the careful, institutionally loyal thinker for whom such material could remain compelling without becoming fully authoritative. Not a true believer in the simple sense, not a complete skeptic either, but a figure for whom the tradition remained possible, interesting enough not to dismiss, uncertain enough not to endorse outright. And that position, more than either total belief or total disbelief, is one of the ways such templates survive inside institutions. And he was not alone. The Counter-Reformation Church was full of such people, men of genuine intellectual ability and genuine institutional loyalty, who found the template compelling, who could not confirm it, and who therefore maintained it in the specific institutional limbo between official endorsement and official condemnation, where the most durable ideas tend to live. Not true, not false, possible, and possibility. In the specific institutional environment of the Counter-Reformation papacy, was sufficient to keep the mechanism running. The 17th century produced, for the Angelic Pope template, a development that would have significant consequences for its subsequent history. It produced critics. Not critics who dismissed the tradition entirely. Such critics had always existed, and the tradition had survived them. But critics who engaged with the tradition seriously, who examined its historical claims with the tools of the new philological scholarship, and who found those claims wanting in ways that they argued clearly and systematically. Most important of these critics was Claude François Ménestrier, the same Jesuit scholar who, as we noted in episode 3, had examined the Malachi prophecy and concluded that it was a 16th century composition rather than a 12th century one. Ménestrier's criticism was not limited to the Malachi forgery. He examined the broader tradition of papal prophecy, the Vatitinia de Summis Pontificibus, the various texts attributed to Joachim of Fiore, the accumulated literature of Angelic Pope expectation, and concluded that most of it was either of uncertain authenticity or demonstrably post hoc composition, that the tradition of accurate papal prophecy was, in significant part, a tradition of describing the past in the language of the future. Vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy from the event. This was a serious critique. It was also, in the specific intellectual environment of the 17th century, a critique that was available to be taken seriously. The tools of philological analysis, the techniques for examining text critically, for establishing dates of composition from internal evidence, for identifying anachronisms and post hoc insertions had been developing since the Renaissance, and were now sophisticated enough to produce arguments that were difficult to dismiss on purely intellectual grounds. The tradition was examined, the examination found it wanting, and the tradition continued, not because the examination was wrong. On the central question of the Malachi text's late composition, Ménestrier appears to have been essentially correct. His analysis of the Malachi prophecy was, as subsequent scholarship has confirmed, essentially correct. His analysis of the broader Angelic Pope tradition was similarly grounded in careful attention to the historical evidence. But correctness, as we have established, is not what sustains the template. Usefulness sustains the template, and the template remained useful to every faction, in every conclave, in every moment of institutional crisis. The template remained the most powerful vocabulary available for expressing the hope that the institution would be better than it currently was. The criticism could not kill that hope, because the hope was not based on the accuracy of the tradition. It was based on the reality of the need. And the need was real. Here is what the Counter-Reformation version of the Angelic Pope template looked like, in its fully developed form. As it entered the 18th century, it was no longer primarily a political weapon. It was no longer the tool of outsiders demanding that the institution change. It had been domesticated, institutionalized, incorporated into the vocabulary through which insiders expressed their aspirations for the institution. By the early modern period, many conclaves could be interpreted, in some sense, through the aspiration for an angelic pope, not in the explicit, programmatic way of the spiritual Franciscans who would proclaim Celestine V, but in the diffuse, ambient way of an aspiration that had become so thoroughly embedded in the culture of the institution that it shaped expectations without being consciously articulated. The cardinals who assembled to elect a new pope were not, for the most part, saying to each other, "We are looking for the angelic pope." They were saying, "We need a holy man, a man of genuine spiritual depth, a man who is not merely an administrator but a pastor, a man whose election will demonstrate that the church is more than its worst moments." This is the angelic pope template, spoken in the language of institutional aspiration rather than prophetic prediction. The content is the same. The framing is different. And the framing difference is crucial. Because prophetic prediction is vulnerable to falsification, the prediction is either confirmed or it is not. And if it is not, there is a problem. But institutional aspiration is not vulnerable to falsification in the same way. If the holy man who is elected turns out to be less than fully holy if he is, as popes tend to be, a complicated human being with virtues and limitations and the specific kinds of compromise that institutional leadership always requires, the aspiration is not falsified. It is merely deferred. We aspired to holiness. We did not achieve it completely. We will aspire again. This is the template in its most resilient form. Not a specific prediction about a specific figure. A permanent aspiration toward a type. And permanent aspirations do not fail. They persist. Through every disappointment. Through every pope who turned out to be human. Through every century that passed without the transformation the template had always promised, the aspiration persists. The pope that never came is always about to come. And the people waiting for him have been waiting for 700 years. And they are still waiting. Because the template was designed not to be fulfilled. It was designed to be useful. And it is still useful. Every single day. In March 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio walked out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in a white cassock and introduced himself to the world. He said, "Buonasera," good evening, and not the formal Latin greeting of a pope assuming the weight of an ancient office, not the practiced eloquence of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Just, "Good evening." As if he had stepped out to greet neighbors from a second-floor window in Buenos Aires. The crowd in St. Peter's Square, which had been standing in the cold March rain for hours, waiting, watching the chimney, and which had erupted when the white smoke appeared, this crowd experienced something in that moment that the template had been promising for 700 years. They experienced recognition. Not recognition of the man. Most of them did not know who Jorge Mario Bergoglio was. He had been a cardinal in Buenos Aires. Not a figure with a significant international profile. He was not the front-runner. He was not the candidate that any of the well-sourced Vatican journalists had identified as likely. But recognition of the type. The humble one. The one who had ridden public transport in Buenos Aires rather than the episcopal limousine. The one who had cooked his own meals rather than employing a household staff. The one who had lived in a simple apartment rather than the archbishop's palace. The one who had chosen the name Francis after the man who had owned nothing. Who had built nothing. Who had simply walked out into the world with the conviction that poverty and joy were not mutually exclusive. The man from outside. The Holy One, the one who seemed, in the specific way that the template had always described, to stand at a different angle to the institutional machinery than the men who had preceded him. The Angelic Pope template, which had been cycling through candidates and producing disappointments for 700 years, attached itself to Francis with remarkable speed. And among those already disposed to see the papacy through that template, his election felt, for a moment, like the possible end of the wait. It was not over, but it felt like it might be. And that feeling, the feeling that this time, finally, the template was being fulfilled, is the mechanism's most powerful product. It is also its most reliable one. To understand why the template attached itself to Francis so completely, you need to understand what it had been doing in the decades before his election. The 20th century had been, from the perspective of the template, an unusually rich period. Not because the popes of the 20th century were unusually corrupt, they were not. By historical standards, the Borgia papacy of the 15th century, the nepotism and political manipulation of the Renaissance papacy, the simoniatic conclaves of the medieval period, these were far more comprehensively corrupt than anything the 20th century produced. But because the 20th century was the century in which the gap between the institution's claims and its reality became visible to a global audience with unprecedented simultaneity. Radio, television, newspapers with global circulation, the gradual development of the communication infrastructure that would eventually become the Internet. Each of these technologies made the papacy more visible not merely to the Catholics of Europe and Latin America, who had always been its primary audience, but to the entire world. And a more visible institution is a more vulnerable institution. The specific corruptions of the 20th century church, the institutional failures that produced the most intense template deployments of the modern period, were not, for the most part, the corruptions of individual popes. They were structural corruptions, the financial scandals of the Vatican Bank, the systematic concealment of clerical abuse, the culture of institutional self-protection that prioritized the reputation of the church over the safety of the children in its care. These were not the corruptions that the template had been designed to address. The template described a corrupt papacy in the medieval sense: wealthy, politically entangled, spiritually hollow. It did not describe, in its original form, the specific institutional pathology of an organization that had developed, over centuries, an elaborate culture of secrecy and self-protection. But the template was flexible enough to adapt. The diagnosis, the institution is corrupt in ways that cannot be corrected from within, fit the 20th century's corruptions as well as it had fit the 13th century's. The prognosis, the reform, must come from outside, from someone untouched by the institutional culture that produced the corruption, fit equally well. The template attached itself to every significant papal election of the 20th century with the energy of a mechanism that had been waiting for exactly this kind of institutional crisis. John Extingfeld, elected in 1958 at 76, described as a transitional pope, turned out to be the man who called the Second Vatican Council the most significant institutional reform of the modern church. The template recognized him immediately. The outsider, the unexpected, the humble one from a family of peasant farmers in Bergamo. John Paul II, elected in 1978, the first non-Italian pope in 4.5 centuries, the first Polish pope, the man who had grown up under Nazi occupation and Soviet communism. The template recognized him too, the one from outside, the one who stood at a different angle to the institutional machinery. Benedict XVI, elected in 2005. The theologian pope, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The template's attachment to him was more ambivalent. He was, in many ways, the institutional insider, the representative of continuity rather than transformation. But he had been, in his earlier career, the theologian who had raised questions about the direction of the church that the template's diagnosis found congenial. And then he resigned, and the template, which had been attached to him with ambivalence, detached with relief, and attached itself to the conclave with the intensity of 700 years of accumulated expectation. The specific reasons why the template attached itself to Francis with such force and why the attachment was, for a time, so compelling illuminate the template's mechanism with particular clarity. Francis was not merely outside the system in the general sense that every new pope is, in some respects, a change from his predecessor. He was outside the system in ways that mapped precisely onto the template's specific vocabulary. He was not European. Every pope in the modern period had been European. The papacy was, in its cultural and institutional DNA, a European institution. Francis was from Argentina, from the global south, from the periphery rather than the center. He embodied, in his biography, the template's demand for someone who stood outside the geographical as well as the institutional mainstream. He was a Jesuit. The Jesuits had always had a complicated relationship with the papacy, the order that had been, historically, the papacy's most effective intellectual and missionary instrument, but also the order that had been suppressed by a pope in 1773 and restored by another in 1814. The order whose founder had demanded a fourth vow of special obedience to the pope, but whose intellectual tradition had always maintained the tension between institutional loyalty and prophetic critique. A Jesuit pope was, structurally, a pope from outside the institutional mainstream of papal succession. He chose the name Francis, not Francis de Sales, not Francis Xavier, the Jesuit saints whose names might have been expected from a Jesuit pope, but Francis of Assisi, the poor man, the man who had stood outside the institutional church's relationship with wealth and power and demonstrated, with his life, that the template's aspiration was not merely theoretical. The template recognized every element, and the people inside the template responded with a specific quality of emotion that recognition produces, not the measured satisfaction of having one's political analysis confirmed, but the overwhelming relief of having believed something for a very long time and finally seeing what appeared to be evidence that the belief was justified. He was the one. He had to be the one. Francis reigned for 12 years. In those 12 years, he did things that previous popes had not done. He spoke about the poor with a directness and a consistency that was not merely rhetorical. He engaged with the environmental crisis in ways that the institutional church had previously avoided. He opened conversations about divorced and remarried Catholics, about the role of women, about the church's relationship with the LGBT community, conversations that his predecessors had closed or avoided. He was, by any honest assessment, a significant pope, a pope who moved the institution in directions it had not been moving. He was also, by any honest assessment, a complicated human being leading a complicated institution. The financial reforms he attempted were incomplete. The culture of institutional self-protection that had enabled the abuse scandals did not disappear, it mutated, adapted, found new forms. The theological debates he opened produced not resolution but deeper division. The conservatives within the church became more conservative in response to his reforming agenda. The progressives became impatient with the pace of change. He was not the Angelic Pope. He was a pope, a good pope. By most assessments, a significant pope, a pope who moved the institution in ways that mattered. But a pope, a human being. A complicated figure in a complicated institution making complicated decisions under complicated constraints. The template, which had attached itself to him with the force of 700 years of accumulated expectation, began slowly and faster to show the signs of the disappointment that every template attachment eventually produces. Not catastrophic disappointment, not the sudden, total collapse that had followed Celestine V's resignation. The template had learned, in 700 years, not to attach itself so completely to specific figures that their failures produced, complete collapse. But the gradual, seeping disappointment of people who had believed that this time was different and who were coming to understand that it was not different in the ways that mattered most, that the institution was changing. Yes, but slowly, partially, in ways that the template's promise of total transformation made feel inadequate. He was not the one. The next pope might be the one. The template began to detach, slowly, and then he died, and the template detached completely, and reset, and attached itself to the next conclave with the energy of a mechanism that has been running for 700 years and has never once been permanently stopped by the failure of the candidates it attached to. The three conditions that make the Angelic Pope template immortal are not complicated. They do not require theological sophistication to identify. They do not require historical expertise to understand. They are visible to anyone who has followed the template's history across the 7 centuries we have examined. The first condition is the absence of a deadline. The template has never committed itself to a specific date. It has never said, the Angelic Pope will come by this year. It has operated, always, in the future tense without a temporal anchor. He is coming. Not, he will be here by 1300, or by 1500, or by 2000. Just, he is coming. The next conclave, the next crisis, the next moment that looks like the moment the template has been describing. A prophecy with a deadline can be falsified by the arrival of the deadline without the fulfillment of the prediction. The Angelic Pope template has no deadline. It cannot be falsified by time. The second condition is the failure absorption mechanism. Every specific candidate who has been identified as the Angelic Pope Celestine the various candidates of the 14th and 15th century conclaves, Savonarola's anticipated figure, the Counter-Reformation's aspirational holy pope, the 20th century succession of recognized and then disappointing pontiffs. Every one of these has failed to fulfill the template's promise, and every failure has been absorbed by the mechanism that converts failure into evidence of the corruption's power, that says he was the one, but the forces against him were too strong, or he was not quite the one, but he prepared the way, or the template was not wrong, it was misapplied head. The actual one is still coming. The failure absorption mechanism is not a logical argument. It is a psychological one. It works because the people inside the template have invested enough in it that acknowledging its failure would require acknowledging the failure of the framework through which they understand the institution they care about. And that acknowledgement is more costly than the reinterpretation. So the failure is reinterpreted, and the template continues. The third condition is the renewal of crisis. The template is most powerful, most compelling, most emotionally resonant, most politically useful in moments of institutional crisis, when the gap between the institution's claims and its reality is most visible, when the need for transformation is most acute. Institutional craze do not end. They may be resolved temporarily, partially, in ways that reduce their immediate intensity. But the conditions that produce institutional crisis, the entanglement of institutions with power and wealth, the tendency of organizations to prioritize their own survival over their stated purposes, the gap between what any human institution claims to be and what it actually is, these conditions are not correctable. They are structural, which means crises recur, which means the template has an inexhaustible supply of the fuel it runs on. Crisis produces need. Need activates the template. The template produces expectation. Expectation attaches to a candidate. The candidate fails or disappoints. The failure is absorbed. The expectation renews. And the next crisis provides the fuel for the next cycle. 700 years. Dozens of cycles. The template running without stopping. Here is the question that the 700-year history of the Angelic Pope template raises. Not the question of whether the template is true. We have established that it is not, in the sense that its specific predictions have not been accurate and its promised transformation has not occurred. Not the question of whether the people who have used it were sincere. Many of them were. And their sincerity does not change the template's function. The question is, what does it mean for an institution that the most powerful vocabulary available for expressing the hope that the institution will improve has, for 7 centuries, been organized around a figure who never arrives? The Angelic Pope is always coming. He never comes. And the perpetual anticipation of his coming has been, for 7 centuries, the most compelling way of saying that the institution should be better than it is, which means that the institution's most compelling aspiration has been organized around an expectation that is structurally designed not to be fulfilled. Because if the Angelic Pope arrived, if a Pope appeared who was genuinely holy, genuinely outside the system, genuinely capable of closing the gap between the institution's claims and its reality, the template would be fulfilled. And a fulfilled template has no further use. The mechanism would stop. And the mechanism is not designed to stop. It is designed to run, which means it needs the Angelic Pope not to come, which means the figure who is always described as the solution is, structurally, the thing that the mechanism is designed to prevent. This is the most disturbing implication of 7 centuries of Angelic Pope expectation. Not that the figure never came, that the mechanism was never designed to produce him. It was designed to produce the expectation of him, perpetually, without resolution, because resolution would end the mechanism, and the mechanism, unlike the popes it describes, does not die. The new pope elected in May 2025 was not, in any obvious, literal sense, the Petrus Romanus of later prophecy, yet almost immediately. Familiar, interpretive habits reappeared. People began searching for symbolic correspondences, signs, and continuities. Was he humble? Yes, or he appeared to be. In the specific ways that papal elections always produce humility performances. And there was no immediate reason to doubt his sincerity. Was he outside the system? In some respects, he was not the obvious front-runner. Not the candidate of the dominant faction. Not the man whom the most well-sourced Vatican journalist had identified as most likely. Was he holy? He appeared to be, as they all appear to be, as the template requires them to appear to be, because the template is the lens through which new popes are first seen. And the template's lens is optimistic. The Angelic Pope template attached itself to the new conclave as it had attached itself to every conclave for 7 centuries, with the specific energy of a mechanism that has been running for a very long time and has not yet found the stopping condition. Because the stopping condition has not been met, and will not be met, not because the right pope has not yet been elected, because the stopping condition is not a pope. It is the end of the need the template answers. And the need does not end, because the institution is not what it claims to be, and the institution will not be what it claims to be, and the gap between the claim and the reality will not close, not completely, not permanently, not in the way the template has always promised it would close when the right figure arrived, because the gap is not a product of the wrong people being in charge. It is a product of the specific tension between what institutions claim and what institutions are, a tension that is not resolvable by the arrival of any individual, however holy, however outside the system, however genuinely unlike his predecessors. The tension is structural. The gap appears to be structural rather than merely personal. The template runs, and the pope that never came is always, perpetually, inevitably about to arrive. There is a final observation that the history of the Angelic Pope template makes unavoidable. The observation is this: the template has been right about something for 700 years, not about the figure, not about the transformation. Not about the timing, or the form, or the specific political implications. About the need. The need for an institution that is what it claims to be. The need for leadership that is genuinely holy rather than merely performing holiness. The need for a figure who can stand outside the mechanisms of institutional self-preservation long enough to see them clearly and challenge them honestly. This need is real. It has been real for 7 centuries. It is real now. And the template, for all its structural unfalsifiability, and all its political deployments, and all the ways it has been used by people with specific institutional interests to advance those interests under the cover of divine mandate, the template has been pointing at something real. The institution should be what it claims to be. The corruption is not acceptable. The gap matters. These are true statements. The template has been making them in various forms for 700 years. And getting the response wrong every time, not because the diagnosis was wrong, because the response it proposed the arrival of the right individual, the transformation through personal holiness, a reform from outside that the system would somehow receive and embody rather than reject and absorb. This response was never adequate to the structural nature of the problem. The Angelic Pope cannot fix a structural problem. No individual can. Not Celestine V, who was holy enough but not institutional enough. Not Savonarola, who was prophetic enough but not patient enough. Not Francis, who is humble enough but not powerful enough. Not the next one. Not the one after that. The template is right about the need. It is wrong about the answer. And the wrongness of the answer does not end the rightness of the need, which means the template will keep running, pointing at something real, with a response that cannot deliver it, for as long as the institution exists. And the institution has existed for 2,000 years, and shows no signs of stopping. The Pope that never came is still coming. The mechanism is still running. The oldest weapon in history has no blade. It has a promise of the right person, in the right moment. Finally, at last, the promise that has been arriving for 700 years, and never arrived, and will be made again, at the next conclave, which is always coming. Every generation of Catholics in crisis has believed the same thing. The next Pope will be different. Not nearly better than the current one, though, that too, but different in kind. Different in the specific way that the template has always described, outside the system, untouched by its corruptions, holy in a way that transforms rather than merely occupies the office. Celestine V's generation believed it. The generation of the Great Schism believed it. Savonarola's Florence believed it. The Council of Trent believed it. The Counter-Reformation believed it. The Second Vatican Council believed it. The Conclave of 2013 believed it. The Conclave of 2025 believed it. Each generation was disappointed. Not because the popes who were elected were bad men, most of them were not. Not because the institution failed to change, it changed. Slowly, in the way that institutions change. Not because the need was not real, it was real. It is real. It will be real. But because no individual can be what the template describes. Because the template describes not a person, but a need. And needs do not get filled by persons. They get managed, partially, imperfectly, over time. The template is not waiting for a person. It is expressing a permanent dissatisfaction with the gap between what the institution claims and what it is. And the history traced here suggests that the gap is structural, not something any one individual can fully close. Which means the template is permanent. Which means the Pope that never came will always be about to come. And the next conclave will begin. And the template will attach itself to the most plausible candidate. and the crowd in St. Peter's Square will wait for the white smoke. And when it comes, they will look at the balcony, and they will see a man. And for a moment, for the specific, overwhelming, 700-year-old moment that the template produces, they will believe that he is the one. The oldest weapon in history has no blade. It has a balcony, and a crowd, and a promise that this time, finally, is the time